Okay. Everything's done. I'm just gonna check the food table to make sure. And I'll be right back. Do you need coffee or anything?
I'll get some.
Okay.
Everything good? Good. Good luck. Computer.
I can't hear her.
We decided to we're not hearing anything.
Bring up your volume.
She did.
Okay, she may be-
No.
No.
Let's do, okay, now can you hear me on Zoom? Can somebody confirm you can hear?
Yes.
Excellent, okay. Thank you. And thanks to our IT team for keeping us connected.
So many different views.
Let me go back to slide deck then.
If you all see here, you see the presentation.
So we are recording portions of this workshop. Not all portions will be recorded. The breakout sessions that we'll have later this morning and this afternoon, we're not going to record, but we are recording this plenary session this morning. And we'll record the breakout reports that we hear later in the day so that we can inform each other about what's happening, and we can refer to that later for our notes and for people who want to listen to that summary. So today we have the challenge of answering all the questions that stakeholders have about this IRP process, in particular, the modeling activity, which is now starting in earnest. We're going to create a welcoming space next door and a policy and education conversation for those of you who are still wanting to explore some basic ideas and are increasing your education and knowledge about this process. And we'll have a lot of discussion about modeling. And our objective for today is to work together to create the stakeholder requested modeling runs that the utility and their consultant team will be doing to augment their modeling process. So at the end of today, you'll be able to fill out a document, a form that is a modeling run request, giving some specification to runs that you would like see done. But we are going to enlist your help in collaborating with other stakeholders and putting those together. You may have some common interests. Let's work together to get a refined set of modeling runs that support stakeholder interest and are also doable in the time frame that we have in front of us. So that's our main objective today. We are totally glad that you are here in person, and those who are here in Zoom, we apologize, you're not going to get lunch or coffee or pastries, but we welcome your ideas. We've set up some process to include you in the meeting, and I'll go over those in a minute. So our specific agenda you can see here on the board, and those on Zoom, you should also be able to go to the gridworks.org website and see a copy of this presentation and all the presentations for today. After welcome and some clarity about what we're doing, some tips about how to incorporate everybody in this meeting. we'll have a couple of presentations by the EPE and their consultant E3 team on a number of topics that you all have asked about and we think is really important for today, including we'll have some time for questions, but don't worry, that's not your only time for questions today. We'll then move into the breakout sessions where my colleague Kathy Boyce from GridWorks is here and she will be facilitating a breakout on policy and general education topics. She's got some fun exercises and some headlines of current events to engage people in a conversation about the general policies and things that you might have questions about. And we'll have a second breakout on modeling detailed conversations. Lunch will be provided. We'll continue our breakouts after lunch, and then we'll hear report outs from each group. We'll have some next steps conversation from the EPE team talking about what they're going to do next and summarizing where we are on these modeling requests. And then we'll summarize and talk about our next workshop, which will be virtual again. So that's our agenda for today. I'm having trouble moving my slides, but let me stop share for a moment and go. You see, but you want to see who's on the Zoom room. We have a great group of people here. And so we wanted to make sure that through the day, we keep this group of folks in mind as we move forward. I'm going to go back to my slide deck here. And those of you on Zoom might have to go to the presentation itself. Okay. A couple of tips. Zoom participants, we're going to encourage you to use chat with a Zoom host. And I'm going to ask right now, Kimani, if you wouldn't mind sending a group chat out to everybody on Zoom that indicates that Kimani is our teammate from El Paso Electric. His job this morning is to make sure those of you on Zoom have a place to put your input. So if you have a question, if you have a particular topic, Kimani and Judy are going to work right now to let you know who you should send a chat to this morning. And so this person can also be able to repeat your questions at the appropriate time. We maybe have limited opportunities for the Zoom folks to speak in person. So we're going to use a translator through our team here. The audio may be suboptimal and there may be some limited opportunities to speak up, but we're going to do our best to incorporate you in the meeting at all. Those of you who are on Zoom, it's possible that you know somebody in the actual room here from a list of the participants. We're going to encourage you to team up. So if you have somebody that you know in the room here in Las Cruces and you're on Zoom, maybe you want to have a communication with that person, your own text or chat or whatever, so that if you have particular ideas, especially when we get to the modeling run request, that you are able to have a proxy in the room here to work with you. So consider that as an opportunity. And if you're on Zoom, raise your hand if you wish to speak during our question and answer session. We'll do our best through our Zoom and through your Zoom host to incorporate you in the meeting. For those of you who are in the room here in Las Cruces, please hold questions until the Q&A sessions that we have scheduled. Be respectful in comments, give each other the benefit of the doubt, share your ideas, and consider being a proxy for some of the folks on Zoom. And at any point you want to see who else is on there, we can make that available. So we're going to do our best to incorporate this great group of people. Right now, I'd like you to get a chance to meet the team. Kathy Boyce, Kathy, would you please stand? Kathy's from GridWorks. You met Deborah Shields in the hallway. Maybe she might stick her head in. Deborah Shields, also from GridWorks. And I'd like the EPE and E3 team, those of you who are here, could you just stand, wave your hand and give your name, please? And why don't we start here with you, Kimani and Judy? Great. And interrupt just a second. This is Deborah Shields with GridWorks also. It's our program administrator.
Good morning. Thank you all for attending our third workshop. My name is Judy Parsons and I'm the regional manager for regulatory research strategy network. Welcome.
Thank you.
California, Emmanuel Yellows, Paso Electric.
Go right to E3. Nathan with E3, good to meet you all. I'm a senior managing consultant with E3, and I'm also our project manager with EPE for the IRP. So look forward to chatting with you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Ben MC, also with E3 Consulting. I'm a director at the Denver office, supporting EPE on this initiative. Full disclosure, this is my fourth New Mexico IRP, having worked for SPS XLA.
Jim Sheets with EP.
Nancy Burns with PPE, nice to see everyone here. Pleasant video.
I can move pages or such.
Morning, everybody. Thanks. I am I'm with the governmental affairs group that helps us
To share your screen.
Morning, everybody.
Slide.
Brian's rep. With EP as well.
Good morning, everybody. David Chacon, EP.
Mine, also with EP.
David's also EP. The guy that usually builds things.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Rhonda Richardson, with market development and resource strategy.
So, Curtis Hutchison with EPE.
She hasn't turned her.
Felipe?
No, I understand when she speaks. You're probably. saying
Where's
back
Grace?
to
Okay,
her. She's.
I want to have this. You want to be a part of it.
okay.
Yeah, right.
Always.
It's not Kelly.
Got it.
And Leslie.
Oh, I introduced myself.
Oh, you did. Sorry, I missed it. Okay, great. So as you can see, we've got a lot of subject matter expertise in the room, and we greatly appreciate our partnership with EPE and E3 as we've worked on this process for a couple of months, and we're looking forward to all your input into that. So you all will get to meet each other in more detail when we're in the breakout session. So don't feel left out yet. We want to give you a more intimate place to have a conversation. We showed this slide at the last workshop and wanted to point out that we spent 2 workshops getting grounded, getting foundational information for people to understand what this process was and what some of the opportunities, challenges, and requirements are that are facing the utility. Now, the bulk of the conversation's moving into modeling.
Make you.
And what does modeling tell us about
It's
what
like a
resources are
temperate time for
required
people.
to meet the system and safety and reliability and sustainability requirements that the utility is obligated to support. So the green boxes here on this slide, the scenario design, what scenarios are you're trying to look at? What are the sensitivities? What are the regulatory and resource adequacy requirements? All those things that go into constraints or opportunities in the modeling is the focus of our conversation today. Now, that doesn't mean that the stuff on the far right is off bounds. Obviously, inputs like load forecast and demand side resources, transmission, fuel prices, all those things that are inputs to modeling are still open for discussion and conversation. You've had some briefings on those at the prior workshop, and we can go back to that content or other content because we've got a great group of people here that can help address those questions. As you see on the left, ultimately we'll get to the point where the model results in the conversation concludes with how much resource of what type by what time need to be added to the system and what actions would be recommended for the utility to take to implement the 20-year plan that is put together in the IRP. That is the output at the end of this process that we'll all be engaging in, and we strongly hope and encourage you all to come back to another in-person workshop in late July or August to really bring together that statement of need and action plan, which culminates the conversation about stakeholder input to the IRP. So stay tuned. We'll hope to keep you engaged throughout this process, and we greatly appreciate your time. We know this is a time-intensive process, especially for those who have participated in all 3 workshops so far. We know it's a lot of your time, but we greatly appreciate your comments, your insight, and your conversation. At this point, before I introduce the EPE team to present their material, I want to encourage you, stakeholders, there's some 3x5 cards on your table. And those of you who are on chat, this is your opportunity to use chat to write. There's one topic that you really need to know more about at this point in the process. Please write it on this card. We're going to team up with the EPE folks to make sure they've got material to present to you later this afternoon on that topic. So feel free to put that on a card, put it at the end of your table. We'll reassess that and make sure that the slide deck or the data is available as we go into the breakout session. And there'll be other opportunities for this, but we want to get at anything that's on your mind now that you want to make sure gets covered. Please put that on a 3x5 card or put it into chat, and we'll ask your chat host to translate those inputs into 3x5 cards. Kimani, if you need extra. Okay. Are there questions so far, though, from the group? Yes, Steve.
We're looking at a lot of things that we tend to categorize as resources in certain buckets. So, you know, transmission, distribution, generation. And so much of what makes an enterprise effective and efficient is the connections between those things. And I want to be sure that you get some discussion space that says, gee, if we're going to do this here, then we need to do this with pricing, or we need to do this with to support that. It's how we put those pieces together. So if you can, and I know as a moderator, it's tough to do that, but if we can get some time to have that kind of discussion, I think that would help me a lot.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I hear you saying that the connection between resource planning and other elements of utility resources, transmission, demand side management, pricing, all those things certainly fit together, Steve. And you know, as you know from your experience, the things that go into the integrated resource plan, fortunately now talk about intersecting with some of those other considerations. And EPE talked at a previous workshop about their integrated system plan, which also now goes into thinking about some of those other elements that connect. So yes, we'll get back to that some more, Steve. If we haven't talked about it as we go through the day, please remind us. Okay, great. Anything else? Any particular question? Anybody on the chat that has a burning question, please raise your hand. And we'll ask Kamani or Kathy or Judy, if you're on Zoom, if you see a hand raised, please let me know.
We do have Rocky. I'll just recognize you in the room as asking for a specific model request. So Rocky, thank you for bringing that up. And let's once we get in past the scenarios and sensitivities, we will come back to that to make sure it's a part of the conversation.
Great. Did you hear that response, Rocky?
Rocky, can you give us a thumbs up if you've heard? Got it.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Emmanuel Villalobos. And what I'll do, Emmanuel, is I will leave the Zoom room up so that we can see who's on there. And I think Kimani is your slide guru, so welcome. And this microphone is on, so I can move my computer.
Yes.
If you need space to do yours. Okay. Will work for you, Mom?
Yes, so
Okay.
perfect. Thank you.
Great. You're welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I see we ran out of coffee. Good morning, everybody. So Emmanuel Villalobos with Paso Electric. I'm the Director for Market Development and Resource Strategy. I really appreciate everybody taking time out of your busy schedules to come in and hang out with us in person. I promise everybody's a lot more fun than I am.
Setting up to share resource.
Oh, no, yeah. We've worked out a sophisticated system of how we're gonna determine the next slide. Sorry, folks, technical difficulties. We're trying to get the PowerPoint to work for those on Zoom. Got it. So just quick, this is the agenda that we're going to be going through today. As always, we welcome all comments, questions. Please, this is for you all. So please, any participation is very much welcome.
Emmanuel,
Sorry.
let me interrupt you. There are also hard copies. You raise your hand if you'd like a hard copy of the slides.
That's our safe harbor statement. Slide. So first off, we're going to start with an overview of where we've been for the last several weeks. As you all remember, oh, we can go to the next slide. So we started off the first two workshops with the intent of developing this shared knowledge base. And every iteration, every additional workshop is going to get just diving in a little deeper and a little deeper. That first workshop gave you an introduction to who EPE is. The second workshop started to lay down the foundation on some of the common terms that you'll see along the modeling process. Today, we're going to go just a little bit further, and we're going to start to talk to you all about the actual IRP, its action plan, the statement of need, and how that's going to be combined or how it fits in with our modeling efforts. So as you can see right now, we're still very early on in the process. After today's session, the next sets of workshops, we're really going to start to get into the nitty-gritty of actually developing the model and getting results out. So today is very important because we're going to need your feedback to see what you want us to model. Slide. So this slide, if you remember, we had it last time, it just shows you, I guess, the overall timeline of what to expect through the IRP. Your first immediate near term, 1 to 3 years, this is where we're really going to be taking whatever immediate actions we can implement now. It's our action plan. That midterm is really important because it's what's going to set you up for the next 10 years, the next 20 years. That further outlook long term, that's where we're looking at policy and law changes. It's that middle term that really is going to set you up for the long term. And this is especially important because as you start to identify resources, you're going to have to get into the actual real world of acquiring, getting approval for, and actually building resources if it's needed. So next slide, please. So really quick, before we get into the 2025, we're going to recap our 2021 statement of need and our action plan. We can go to the next slide. So these 7 topics up here are what the 2021 IRP action plan had. These are the efforts that EPE needed to engage in over the last 4 years. Well, we're going to get into each and every one of these in a little more detail. So we can go on to the next slide. So that first topic that you saw is EPE will continue moving forward with the selected resources previously approved in our RPS and our cases. Those are the case numbers up there. The important part to look at here is what actually came out of the continuing to move forward with these selected resources. That was a selection of Buena Vista 1 and 2 that came online July of 2023. We also had we had to file a notice of default for Hecate 1 and 2, the other resource that was selected from that previous RFP. We'll dive into that in a little more detail on a slide further down. For those of you all that have been following EPE along that journey, we had to have monthly status reports that were being filed, that was keeping people up to date on what the status for Hecate 1 and 2 were. Go on to the next slide. The second topic is your focuses on your annual Renewable Energy Act, our yearly filing for the RPS to meet our renewable portfolio standards. We are currently working on this year's. It will be filed May 1st, 2025. It's going to give you an update on where EPE is currently in meeting its RPS goals and how we're looking in the future and actions that we can take in order to meet our RPS goals. So this here is just laying out the 4 different filings that we had for our yearly RPS compliance. A quick update here that we will fall into later is, as we are trying to meet our RPS compliance, like I mentioned, we had that one facility, Hecate 1 and 2, that had to be, we had to file that notice of default. As a response to that, again, as EPE is always trying to be proactive, we have issued a short-term RFP for additional energy and rec resources. Unfortunately, because of some nuances within the current rule, the only offer that we found for recs was from PNM, but they were unable to sell us the excess generation and recs that they had because of some nuances within the rule that they cannot sell from a facility built after 2019. But we are still looking as to what proactive actions we can do to try to get back on track and meet our goals. We can go on to the next slide, please. So the next topic that we had listed for part of our IRP action plan is the energy efficiency and load management plan. This lays out the last 2 filings that were done for the load management plan. Move on to the next slide. More of what we just touched on right now. Another portion of our action plan was the New Mexico RFP in 2021. That one resulted in a selection of 130 megawatt solar, 65 megawatt battery system. That is called the Carne project. That one, a current update on it, it had a COD, a commercial operation date for 2025. It has now been pushed back to February 2026. It is not ideal, but it's just something that happens when you're developing these types of projects. You're talking about 5-year, 4-year development projects, hundreds of millions of dollars, tons of different construction crews and regulations and all that. Pushes in your COD are common. So it's not something to be afraid of. It's just something that we have to deal with and move on. Our next slide. So another action item was we will conduct sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. On mine. We were going to do a demand side potential management study that has been completed. Go on to the next slide, please. Another point that we needed to do was the voluntary renewable energy programs, the New Mexico Community Solar, and those are on their way as well. Okay, next slide. And here, the last item, I believe, is the filing for abandonment for units Newman 1 and Rio Grande 7. For those of you that were with us on the last workshop, I had a couple tables of all of the resources that EP currently has. And if I had asked everyone to pay special attention to those retirement dates, these are those units that were up next for retirement. So it's Newman 1 and Rio 7. Now, common questions that we get are, they are going to be retired and abandoned. And on a planning perspective, from where we are working on now, they are not a part of the modeling process. However, once you start to get into the actual operational year, we may actually call on those units and they would be working in service within the year, but they're not as part of our plan. And that's because as we're waiting for additional resources to actually come online, that's when we would feel that it's safe and reliable to actually remove the units completely offline. So you won't see them on the planning perspective, but you may still see them operationally as we're transitioning new resources on and old resources off. Next slide. So this is just the notice of material changes that was filed this week, I believe. And where we outlined what material changes have occurred within our action plan for the last 4 years. The first of which is that removal of the Hecate facility that I previously mentioned. The second is the increase of the New Mexico jurisdictional share of Buena Vista 1. So that was done as a result of not having that one facility come online on time. We had to increase the allocation of Buena Vista for New Mexico, and that was a material change. And the third is the atypical amount of new service inquiries. This is because of the new potential large load customers that we're seeing in the area. It is not unique to El Paso or Texas or New Mexico. This is happening across the country. There is a huge influx of new large customers that are trying to come online. It is a common occurrence for every utility in the country. We are no different. We are all in the same boat trying to figure out how we can get these resources or these customers online. We'll go to the next slide. So this is, I'm going to hand it off to your next speaker, Enedina. Here, I think the biggest takeaway to look at is in my previous slide where we were looking at the 5 to 10 year, that midterm that I asked everybody to focus on. That's the real meat of it. Is look at that here in terms of how our load growth is being seen. Now, Enedina.
And just to note in your packet, this slide, the previous slide that Emmanuel just talked about is not in your hard copy. That was an addition yesterday, but that version is on the gridworks.org website, so you can get the full set of slides that we presented there.
So yeah, I just want to point out here that we have seen some differences in our projections for the native system demand since the last IRP. So if you take a look at this table here, you'll see some of these differences. Most of these differences are just a result of us updating our forecast on an annual basis. We do update the forecast at the beginning of the year, and this allows us to update some of the historical data that goes into our modeling each year to include the actual data from the previous year. We also update some of our underlying assumptions, such as the economic and demographic variables that we use to make our projections, as well as our weather assumptions. And we're also just continually looking at to see how we can improve our forecast. So one of the improvements that we've made since the 2021 forecast was a change to how we project EV adoption. So back in 2021, we were relying on an exponential growth model to project this adoption. However, since then, we've now adopted an S-curve model, which we feel is more representative of how customers actually adopt new technologies. We've also included some assumptions for managed charging, and we've added 3 additional forecasts to account for the different vehicle types, medium duty, heavy duty, and electric buses. Next. So if we take a look at this graph here, what this shows is just the graphical representation between the 2 forecasts that we were just looking at. So you can see how they've changed. What Emmanuel just pointed out that we have seen several inquiries from new large load customers. The additional load from these customers is not shown in these forecast projections that you see here. And here we can just see a comparison between the year-over-year growth between both forecast models, the one used in the previous IRP and our latest model. And again, a lot of the changes between these 2 models are due to the change in EV forecasting methodology, as well as just some new organic growth that we're seeing. Okay, next. And that's it. I'll pass it back over to you, Mom.
I'm back. Sorry. So like I mentioned, the first part, we were talking about what's happened since in our 2021. Now let's get into the 2025 IRP, the action plan, considerations, our statement of need. And go into the next slide, please. So this here just outlines the appendix from the IRP rule. I'm not gonna torture you and read it all for you, but what I want you to take into account here is these are all of the considerations that we have to take in addition to the modeling. So it's not just about the inputs that go into the model. It's also about everything that we have to do in order to provide safe, reliable, affordable power. So you're going to notice common themes throughout the discussions today for reliability, affordability, resiliency. The next slide, please. Slide. So straight from the rule, that's the actual statement of need. Now, what I want you to take from these workshops, and especially from today's, is that the modeling from the IRP, you're not going to identify the actual resources that you're going to need. What you're going to get is you're going to get a set of different portfolios for every scenario that we run. From there, we take all of those different portfolios and we start to find the commonalities between them. Once we determine what is common between all of these different scenarios, then we issue an RFP. It's that RFP that will then determine what resources are actually out there in the real world to be developed. Next slide. That's your action plan. Again, this is just a reminder of all the points that we're going to need to hit under this new rule for the new IRP. These are the things that you're going to see highlighted within our action plan. So it's going to be our specific actions. We're going to have to be a little more detailed in how we're going to develop different resources. On to the next slide. Here, just think of this, we're really teeing up what the later conversations are going to be for today, especially on the modeling. So you notice the same timeline on the bottom, but we're still focusing on the left side of the process here. It's not a iterative process where we do one and then the other. In some manner, we are working on all three on the left. We are working on the resource adequacy ELCC studies. We are developing modeling inputs as we speak. We are starting to get initial results from our base case for the modeling expansion. And it's going to be all of these that we take in order to create our statement of need, to create our action plan. So this is just giving you an overall sense of where we are in the process. Next slide. This is an interesting, I like this one because it shows you that loads and resources is really a balancing act, as it's not a science, it's not an exact science, it's more of a subtle art where you're trying to make that connection between your loads and your resources. And this is really just going to build out what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides for your loads and resources table. And again, how we're trying to solve for a capacity need, but it's not the only factor that we need to consider. We need to consider energy requirements, different economic factors, regulatory factors. So all of that goes in conjunction as we're trying to find the right balance between your loads and your resources. Next slide. This is just a graphical representation of where we are now on our current resources. So you see everything that's in the Texas, New Mexico area, and then on the far left, we have our nuclear generation in Arizona from the Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station. Next slide.
So Emmanuel, we're gonna,
Yes.
we'll pause to take a few questions before you get
yes,
into the
I'm sorry.
detail of loads and resources, if that's okay.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I say, hold here, and we were gonna give 5 or 10 minutes for questions on what's been presented to so far. So let's start here in the room. Any questions you have so far from what Emmanuel and Anadina have talked about? Yeah, Steve.
I wondered if we could get a copy of the demand side report that's been put together. I guess it says 1 and 2.
The study,
Yeah, the
Study.
the
study.
demand.
So we can see exactly what that entails. Is that available?
Somebody from that particular department, David.
Actually, they may have referred out to Victor. He was, he's on the Zoom call.
Okay. Victor, can you hear the conversation? The question is, can the demand side study phase 1 and 2, can that be made available, or did you want to, do you want to hear a summary of that now, or you want to look at it later?
Yeah, just a copy of the report later.
Okay, can we get a copy of the report?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Yeah, we don't need to. I just want to know what it entails.
Okay, I'm sorry, I thought you wanted to go into.
No, no.
Absolutely.
And then the other piece of information is the forecast on electric vehicle adoption. It's kind of blended into some other stuff here, and I'd like to see that separately.
Yeah, we can talk about that too. The details of the EV forecast?
Yeah,
Yeah. we can talk about
yeah, or if you've got a report, whatever.
it.
Let's put that on the list for the modeling discussion this afternoon.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Actually, both of those would be good on the list.
Okay,
Okay, and we're gonna go into more detail about that. You know, this is the first part of the presentation. A little bit later on, as you can see in some of the slides, there's a lot of details which we're gonna talk about scenario sensitivity that will tie directly into that breakout group with the model. So I think some of those questions can definitely be answered.
Perfect.
Great.
okay. How about on Zoom? Is there, Kathy, was there a question or two you want to repeat?
Yeah, I'm gonna, Rocky, thank you, asked during Anadina's, the demand forecasting, asking about large load customers. What does that mean? Are we talking essentially data centers in the 350 megawatt load side, or what is a large load customer?
We're looking at customers between, I would say, above 80 megawatts or 80 megawatts and above.
Thank you. Rocky, does that satisfy? Good, okay, thank you.
Anything else? on
And
this?
we've got several folks who weighed in on specific modeling runs that they would like. So Chris Leger, thank you,
Sorry,
I see that as well.
Maybe we can add a little bit more characteristics for those large loads from the EP side. Might be helpful to answer that question. And do you want to just talk about like the load factor of those sorts of customers and how they might differ from just typical load?
Right, well, some of the load customers that we're looking at typically have a high load factor. We're modeling them at 97% load factor. For reference, our system load factor is around 45%. So it's customers with a significantly higher load factor that we're seeing.
So can I interject for those of us who are new to
Yeah.
modeling by load factor? Can you explain what that means?
It's pretty much the relationship between energy and demand, how demand is relative to energy. So for example, a customer with a high load factor would have a relatively flat load shape, whereas a customer with a low load factor has a very peakish load shape where they just use the majority of their energy in one concentrated area of time.
So their need for energy is pretty constant.
Yes.
24 hours a day.
That's
So we see a lot in the news about flexible load with data centers. From EP's experience, is that reasonable? Does that feel like that's doable, what these large load customer requests?
Manuel, you want me to answer that too?
Absolutely.
So we talked to Bryn Davis, we talked to large loads. What we're seeing in these large data center loads is when they say they're flat and they're gonna use 95 megawatts an hour, or whatever, they're doing it 24/7. That we have not seen anybody with any notable variability. They might move, I'll say 5 megawatts because they figured out how to cool better or whatever. But relatively insignificant to the issues that Emmanuel's team, the E3 guys gotta go look at. They just have to assume it's on all the time.
Great. And did you want to expand on, is data center load growth what you're seeing mostly from load growth? Or are there other types of industries that have different characteristics, different load factor? Or is it predominantly data centers?
There's a lot of sources of load. We're just seeing a tremendous amount of data center inquiries.
Okay.
And they're just big.
Great.
But there are manufacturing plants that have this better diversity number and are more flexible in their load. But anytime you hear the word data center, it just means that they're using the same amount of power at 3 o'clock in the morning that they're using at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So that term to us doesn't mean a different type of load. It just means to these guys that it's there all the time.
Great.
So if I could ask a follow-up coming from the chat, so the larger loads coming out of the system, what does that mean for other customer rates?
Not my answer.
Well, I'll say just for generally speaking, if you think of large customers with a lot of energy consumption relative to their peak demand. And peak demand typically is what drives most utility costs, certainly our utility costs. They have more energy from that customer. You have a larger base to distribute your fixed costs over. So a good portion of utility costs are essentially fixed. And so to the extent you have more energy, you can spread those costs in over a larger number of kilowatt hours. And I won't say it absolutely benefits other customers, but it acts as an offset, or it acts as a reduction to overall average rates. Now, it differs between classes, but generally speaking, it should benefit all customers in the sense that you're spreading fixed costs over a large number of kilowatt hours.
Great. Thank you, Jim.
Yes, Steve.
So just a question.
The last one, and then we'll go back. Okay, go ahead. Last one, then we'll continue.
Is that if you add a large load, say it's, 100 megawatts for a data center, the system's somewhat maxed out already, so you're gonna need to build 100 megawatts of capacity to catch the peak. So that while maybe your load factor improves, the amount, arithmetically, the amount of unused capacity remains the same in megawatt hours. Am I conceptualizing that properly?
Well,
And this is about me an EP3 answer to.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, so there's two parts to that. So the principles of rate design is that you allocate costs to the cost causer. So if you can literally say, I added 100 megawatts because I need 100 megawatts for this customer, the cost of that would all be assigned to that customer.
Mhm.
And so it wouldn't impact, and we're talking in great generalities here, but it wouldn't impact any other customers. But remember, that same customer who you're adding at 100 peak is also using 100 at all other hours where you did have excess capacity. So it's really about that excess capacity that you have in the off-peak periods or the non-peak periods. So you account for the increase in peak demand with a dedicated resource potentially. But then that same customer is using up your slack capacity and you're distributing the cost of that capacity across more kilowatt hours. So if all of the costs associated with the incremental load is assigned to the customer, and at the same time, you're sharing more cost across with that same customer across kilowatt hours, you're actually reducing rates for all other customers. You're not adding anything at peak in terms of their cost, but you're reducing their cost in all other hours.
We'll get into more detail on that. It still doesn't quite make sense to me.
Okay, stay tuned.
And I'll
Yeah.
preface it with, obviously, this is theoretical, right? I
Right.
mean, and so there's a lot of ifs in there, if you allocate the cost, you know, and not, and things like that.
You can do something.
Yeah, Chris.
If you're interested in this, there's a great new report from Duke that came out, looking at data center flexibility and the structure of that. They've shown that if the data centers can be flexible for less than 100 hours a year, we could basically bring on most of the data centers right now. Without any of that, because they would just not be on during the week. So it is a mammoth distinction for high loads factor, especially if you can take them out of heat. It means that right now, El Paso Electric, if we could take out 200 hours out of the peak and say, you can't be on during those times, they can serve another 600 megawatts of load right now. So it's a really great report. It's a big distinction to make to understand the load duration curve. And I'll make sure that you guys have that report.
Great, thank you, Chris.
I've got one more online, if I could follow up, and it's pretty quick.
Okay.
Yep, Kara, thank you. Are the data center inquiries for locations in specific areas near towns, which one?
They're really spread out over.
Give
the
it
source.
back to smart data centers, and I read that smart data center users are looking where the transmission infrastructure is. They're not looking to be in town or not in town. They're looking at what the best location is for them to get power.
Great.
One note on the question from Kathy, where do we see the growth? And Adina pointed out something that was really interesting. We have a lot of growth and yet we haven't had a data center come in. And so what it really is stemming from the last IRP to this IRP, one of the biggest drivers is it's been very hot.
Yeah.
And our sensitive customers are using more, but they're also growing at a faster rate than a lot of the nation. So our residential customers, you know, we have strong growth, 1.6, 1.8% growth. They're switching from swamp coolers to evaporative air. You're seeing year-over-year growth in that segment, like 7-ish% sometimes. So although their energy might be, you know, going at a 2% rate, you're seeing these big pops in demand, further reducing our load factor and increasing that drives.
Great, thank you, George, that's helpful. Okay, Emmanuel, back to you to continue. Thanks for that pause or questions.
No, that was
Okay.
great. Thank you. We encourage the conversation, please. I've shown you this to you all in the previous ones. There's nothing changed. It's just to show you what is going into our loads and resources. This is showing you our conventional generation. The next slide is our table of renewable generation. And then the one after that should be the planned resources that we have coming online. Again, everything that's going to go into the LNR discussion. Go to the next slide, please. Now, if you recall earlier in Adina's presentation where she showed the 2021 load curve and then the orange line for that 2024, that's that orange line now. And this here with the blue line that's higher is including some of the customers that we are confident are coming online. That's not anyone in specific, but these are some of the large load customers that we know now are going to be coming online, or large manufacturing. So this blue line here is now our new floor. So anything that happens from here would be above that. Next slide. So this here is a very simplified version of our loads and resources table. Normally when this is shown, there's dozens of lines, line items, iterating everything. So this is just kind of a summary here to kind of help bring that concept all together. So you'll see the total accredited capacity at the top. That's basically all of your capacity resources, what they can contribute at time of peak together. You have your firm load obligations. That's the load that we are responsible for serving. That does not include interruptible load. And then your planning reserve margin, that's just that percentage calculation that we had spoken about in the last workshop. Then your capacity need is that total. So you take your firm load obligations, you add on your planning reserve margin, which you need in order to reliably serve your load. That would take into account for weather anomalies, outages, things like that. And that gives you your total capacity need. You take your total accredited capacity, and subtract it from your capacity need, and you wind up with your position there. Red and negatives is not a good thing. So what that is identifying there is that there is a system need. What you need to stress here is that we do have tools in our tool belt that will help us mitigate this, like going out into the open market to procure that shortage that is addressed. But then again, going out into the open market, you are going to be subject to different market forces. So prices, fuel prices increases, swings and temperature and all that, that will affect market pricing, market volatility. So you don't want to be relying only on market purchases to meet that gap.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Planning reserve margin, is that also negative? Or you've got a positive number of 9%, right?
Yes.
9% to 11%. I had always thought that would have to be 15%. Can someone speak to why it's not 15%?
So Orland, we're gonna hold that till the end, but that's a good question. So I'll go through these and then we'll come back to that question. Thanks.
I could just say at a high level, it's, a study that was done for the IRP. And there's a blue box here at the bottom that describes, this loss of load probability analysis. So I believe EP has a, goal of 0.2 loss of load equivalent, meaning like that many days or events per year. And then that drops to 0.1 in 2030. So these percentages are based on that goal of EP. So loss of load. Okay. Yeah.
No, thank you. The next slide.
And you had a question back here.
Let's hold, can we hold the question till we get done with these slides? Great, thanks. Thanks for your patience. We'll do the same opportunity for the folks on Zoom. Thanks.
So this is just illustrating everything that we've been talking about this morning. You see your generation stacked on the bottom. You can see that your generation is actually going down over time. That's because you see unit retirements. You have PPAs that are completing or coming to the end of their life. So you see your generation coming down, you see your capacity need, and then your capacity need plus your reserve requirement on top of that going up. So that's just increasing that need over time. And I should have pointed out that the previous slide and this one is looking at EP system as a whole. The next two slides show the exact same thing, but specific to New Mexico. Go to the next slide. So this is what your loads and resources looks like specific to the New Mexico portion of our footprint. Still, you're short, not a good position to be in. And the next slide shows you that same illustrative purpose and how your deficiency is growing over time, which means that we need to focus on what we can do in the immediate to remedy that and start to focus on what we can do in the midterm to start to address those shortages. Go to the next slide. And the next slide. So here, it's just an explanation that EPE is multi-jurisdictional. We have 80% of our load footprint is in Texas, 20% of it is in New Mexico. We do calculate as a portfolio, and then we allocate from a system basis down to what's required specific for New Mexico and different for Texas. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to E3 so that they can go into the next portion of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Emmanuel. While we're shifting speakers, let's go back to the question. There was a question in the back that we didn't get to. Yeah, go ahead, please, Robert.
Thanks. On slide 31, you show a forecast with large load assumptions.
Can you go ahead?
The large load assumptions there, is that all of the requests? Is that all the requests that have been studied? Is that, how do we see that large load assumption?
No, those are not anywhere close to the requests or inquiries that we had. That is just the customers that we know are coming online, large manufacturing. That does not include all of the data center inquiries that we've got and all of the other large load customer inquiries that we've got. This is just what we know is coming online.
So basically, like, bird in the hand rate assumption, like, people that have signed service agreements for rate and determined.
At different states in the process, but yeah, executed contracts.
Execute contracts. Okay. Thank you.
And we've got a couple on chat. Kathy,
Yeah,
do you have-
and Orlando, we'll come back to you, to Orlando's side. So related to the data centers and the demand growth that you're seeing, will it compromise EPE's ability to meet the RPS requirements? And by RPS, the renewable portfolio standards, so the amount of renewable energy that needs to be on the system by certain years.
If the load's located in New Mexico, yes.
And it's the load is not specifically just data centers, so we just heard as well, air conditioning, residential growth. So it's a variety of factors that are seeing the load increase.
Was there, Orland, did your question get answered about the planning reserve margin?
I'm not certain it has. So in the past, loads and resources tables that I've been provided, I see a 10%, 10.1% planning reserve margin, and I'm seeing 9% here. And so I'm seeing the kind of a shrinkage there, and I just want to clarify, maybe I've got a misconception, but I had always thought that it needs to be a 15% planning reserve margin. I don't know if El Paso Electric has ever had that, or you all are planning for that.
Can I take the first stab at that? Can everyone hear me okay? So first and foremost, I just want to draw some distinctions on planning reserve margins. This is getting much more complicated than it's been in the past, right? So historically, the way utilities used to do planning reserve margin requirements was what they called on an ICAP basis, or an installed capacity basis. So the 15% you're referring to is like what you see in the SPP, right? So you see that for SPS. So the way that was historically calculated is all of the thermal resources got 100% of their accreditation. In understanding that thermal resources were not 100% reliable, you just tagged it onto the planning reserve margin, right? Now things are getting a little bit more sophisticated. So what we're starting to see now is we're doing accreditation based on an ELCC basis. So even thermal resources don't get 100% accreditation. So what that means is a thermal resource, a gas resource, has lower accreditation, but it means you don't have to hold it within the planning reserve margin requirement bucket. So that's just one distinction. So if you look at the SPP now, like the SPP have a 15% installed capacity planning reserve margin requirement, they now have a much lower, what they call ACAP PRM, which is accredited capacity. So just keep in mind, as you compare utilities, you're not always comparing apples to apples anymore like you once were. The second part of that is every single utility is distinct in the way you calculate the planning reserve margin requirement. So if you broke up all of the RTOs into individual utilities, what you would actually see is the planning reserve margin is driven by their loss of load probability. So if you have a utility that's in a geographical area where temperatures don't swing much, you may not need so many planning reserves, right? You can be more confident in what your load's going to be over time. If you have a utility that's in a volatile temperature area where you see huge temperature swings across, it's 30, 40 years, then that utility may have a higher planning reserve margin requirement. So those are just two examples of saying the planning reserve margin changes for every utility. And then also, you're not always comparing apples to apples. So there is no one number. There is no 15% requirement or 10% requirement. It's unique to the utility, and it's done on a loss of load probability study.
Great, thank you. Good question. Let's go to Dawn first.
I seem to remember from other IRPs that when you're putting together how much you need for the planning reserve margin or the overall load, earlier was mentioned going into the open market and buying stuff. Can that be included in what your calculations are to achieve that? What you can buy, you project you can buy elsewhere, or does it have to be resources in hand with the utility?
Happy to.
We don't include those purchases because there's no guarantee that you're actually going to find it on the open.
Okay, that's the question. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, may I ask what is the loss of load probability then? What is the current, what's the required LOL?
Yeah, so there is no industry-wide requirement, but there is moving towards best practices, right? So when you look at loss of load, you typically, when you're planning an electric system, you can't plan for 100% reliability, or you could, but it would be extremely expensive, right? So most utilities plan to a metric, what they call a loss of load expectation. The industry is moving towards a standard of 1 day in 10 years. So that is the probability that you plan for, or 0.1 day every single year. At the moment, you see, if we can go back to the L and R table slides. We're going forward. Yeah.
35?
Okay.
35.
Oh, there we go. Let's just double one of those.
No, the table.
The table, yeah, so go back. Here we go. So right now, you'll see the planning reserve margin jumps from 9% to 11% in 2030. And that's because EP are moving towards that industry standard. Right now, EP are planning to a 0.2 LOLE. That gives you the 9%. Then 2030, 0.1, that increases it to 20%.
I'm just talking about this IRP. It's just this specific IRP.
So this specific IRP for calendar years 26 through 29 is a 0.2 LOLE expectation. And then in 2030, it steps up to a 0.1 or 1 day in 10 years.
Okay, thank
Did you have another comment?
No, working as a proxy.
Oh, good, thank you.
Yeah, Victor and Tony just provided the answer that phase one is a public document now. It's part of the energy efficiency filing. And it's available to download for anybody just by, searching, but we can provide a copy.
Great, good. Thank you for bringing that back.
I was just gonna finish up the point on PRM, if that's all right. So you've seen a different number in the past. So in the last IRP, we did loss of load probability analysis together with E. And that has been refreshed for this IRP. And what loss of load probability analysis really does is it looks at EPE's load over thousands of potential kind of weather years, to make sure that, in the whatever threshold we have, that they're meeting load, there's not that loss of load event beyond 0.2 or 0.1. So we refreshed that modeling with their current system and updated data in terms of thousands of weather years to understand kind of what that PRM percentage needs to be to ensure that threshold of loss of load. So that's why the numbers have also changed. And that's where the 9 and 10, 11% are coming from.
And just carrying on one last thought on that subject. We actually have a lot of slides on this topic. So as we come into these breakout discussions later, when we go into the education one, when we go into the modeling discussion, if you really want to jump into the weeds of how LOLP modeling is done, we have slides we can present. Just give us a kind of a thumbs up now and we can just get them ready. So
I appreciate that.
Okay.
We've got one question on Zoom, and then we're gonna go on so that Ben can finish the presentation. So go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, an element that hasn't come up yet. And Chris, I'm pulling from your question, Chris Leger from Interwest, transmission constraints and the impact of the day ahead market. How will that affect planning and action plan consideration?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Yeah, transmission constraints and potential new transmission day ahead market impacts. How will that affect resource planning?
Well, as we're moving from the IRP to the ISP, we're gonna start to take transmission into account. As EPB is also transitioning into an organized day-ahead market, that type of planning will also be taken into account. So it will be planned for.
Okay. Okay, and Chris is asking for a specific model run, so my guess is you'll hear this come back in the modeling group. Thank you, Chris.
Great, okay. Then back to scenarios and sensitivities.
Okay, so just confirming again, everyone can hear me at the back. Can everyone understand my accent? I've been in Texas, New Mexico a long time, so I will try and talk slow, but I do take no offense whatsoever if you want to interrupt and ask me to repeat myself. So if we go to the next slide. Okay. And we go to the next slide. Okay, so first and foremost, Emmanuel has just presented EP's capacity need, looking forward over the next 20 years. The first thing that we're going to do is obviously have to solve that capacity need. So how do we do that? Well, we have to use a computer model. There's no way Nate and I can sit there doing hand calculations to work out the optimal portfolio of resources. So what we do is we plug all of these inputs and assumptions
into a model, and then the model tells us what's the most economical portfolio of resources to meet that need. So if we go to the next slide. So here's some examples of the inputs and assumptions that go into those complex computer models. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see we have load forecast, we have renewable portfolio standards requirements, we have system topology. So lots of inputs and assumptions go into these models. These are all forecasts looking 20 plus years into the future. So what do we know about forecasts? We know they're going to be wrong. Okay. And Adina does a fantastic job for load forecasting, but I guarantee you in 20 years' time, if you look back at the load forecast today, it's not going to be correct. So how do we address the inherent uncertainty that comes with computer modeling? If we go to the next slide, we start talking about scenarios and sensitivities. And what we mean by scenarios and sensitivities is we're not just going to run one modeling run. We're going to run different modeling runs under different inputs and assumptions to see how the results of the modeling exercise change under these different scenarios. Now, we can argue all day long of what constitutes a scenario, what constitutes a sensitivity. I've worked for a lot of utilities. Everyone has different interpretation. The key here, though, is just that we can make changes to the model to see how the outputs change. Now, also when we talk about modeling, it is complex and it takes a lot of time. So some of the scenarios and sensitivities that are going to come from the stakeholders during this process may be relatively easy scenarios to run. We may be able to go into the model, change an input and assumption here, rerun it pretty quickly. Some of them are extremely complex. So just want to flag that as we look at developing scenarios and sensitivities, some of these may take 2 months just to develop the inputs and assumptions. We may need to call some of the stakeholders and say, hey, you asked to see a scenario in which EPU do X. And we need to come back to you guys and ask, well, what do you mean? Can we quantify it? Can we get some further clarification on these inputs and assumptions? So this is just really to set the scene that this takes a long time and we're going to do the best we can. We just appreciate your patience as we work through this. We go to the next slide. So here is an example of a scenario. And again, please don't get too drawn into the distinctions between scenarios and sensitivities. It is a gray area. But here are just 2 example scenarios from EPE. On the left, they have a strong climate policy scenario. On the right, they have kind of an economic growth in this geographical region scenario. And what we're trying to show here is under these scenarios, many of the different inputs and assumptions change. Okay, so you could think of a scenario as kind of a level 1, like as a hierarchy, and it drives different inputs and assumptions beneath it. So if you came up as a stakeholder and said, hey, I want to see a scenario where we have hydrogen, green hydrogen production, just know that's not necessarily just one change, right? That's not just saying it's additional resource. It's also saying, well, how do you create that green hydrogen? We need additional electricity, green electricity to create hydrogen. So that's a scenario, it can input many different inputs and assumptions. If we go to the next slide.
Quick bit.
Yeah.
I was just going to emphasize the text is really small in front of you. This is not, these are not scenarios for EPE. These are sample kind of example exploratory scenarios from Salt River Project or SRP.
Yeah.
Just making that real clear.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. Yeah, so this is just examples, just discussing kind of potentials here. And if we go to the next slide. When we talk about sensitivities, we're tending to talk about how does that portfolio change when you change one key variable. So for example, what happens if we change the price of natural gas and we see a high or a low natural gas price? What happens if we see this scenario with increased demand side resources, a virtual power plant, demand response? So that's really kind of a high level distinction, but again, gray areas are where a scenario becomes a sensitivity and vice versa. So as Nate said, everything we've just looked at is kind of just generic, just setting the tone. Now let's get into EPE specifically. So if we go to the next slide. Here is the list of, or the process flow chart for the scenarios and sensitivities that EPE would be running just as a core set of scenarios. And this is just aligns with best practices for utilities, particularly regulated utilities. So on the left side, Emmanuel mentioned earlier, EP is a multi-jurisdictional state, which means it operates in Texas and it operates in New Mexico. And believe it or not, those two states have very different rules and different perspectives on what the future of energy looks like. So the first thing we need to do is establish a baseline just for the entire system. So EP plan their systems as a whole. They plan for Texas and New Mexico concurrently. So on the left here, the first scenario that we are going to run is just what is the least cost portfolio of resources for the system. And in that scenario, we are just going to temporarily set aside any New Mexico specific rules and requirements. So just what is the lowest cost portfolio of resources? And we're going to run the model and it's going to tell us the resource portfolio is X, Y, and Z. We're going to do two different sensitivities underneath that scenario. The first is we're just going to look up existing commercially available technologies. So that would be for 8-hour lithium-ion storage. It's going to be wind, it's going to be solar, it's going to be gas-fired CTs, it's going to be demand response, it's going to be DRs. Anything that EPE feels like they could issue an RFP today and there would be a legitimate, reliable, feasible project on the back end. But keep in mind, we're planning for 20 years in the future. We know things are going to change. There's going to be emerging technologies that are available at some point in the future that are not available today. So the second scenario we're going to run here is this emerging technologies. And we're going to say, okay, what does the portfolio look like if you assume in the mid-2030s, as an example, that SMRs are available commercially or long duration storage is available? So that way we're going to be able to say, okay, what is the least cost based on today's technologies? What are the least cost based on potentially tomorrow's technologies? That sets the scene for the system-wide planning. However, New Mexico does have its own rules and requirements, particularly the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So now when we move to the right and we start looking at scenarios that are compliant with New Mexico state requirements, we are then going to take the least cost portfolio and then we are going to add in the Renewable Portfolio Standards requirements. So this would be the first scenario that would inform the statement of need. So we're going to see, okay, this was the least cost portfolio. This is the least cost portfolio with New Mexico specific requirements. And that will help us inform which resources are allocated to the system and which resources are allocated directly to New Mexico. Underneath this umbrella, underneath this scenario, we then have two different paths to look forward to. The first path is to say, New Mexico has a 2045 carbon-free requirement. Therefore, EPE cannot build or cannot allocate any new gas to the state of New Mexico. That would be this no new gas scenario. The second scenario would be EPE can build new gas today. However, by 2045, it needs to be carbon-free. And there's two ways of meeting that at the moment, maybe more in the future. Primarily, you're looking at either carbon capture or you're looking at converting those natural gas-fired units into a carbon-free fuel, such as hydrogen. So again, two paths here. And then underneath these paths, depending on whether it's gas or no new gas, we'll look at different technology assumptions. So first, just the existing commercially available technologies today, as I described earlier. Under the emerging technology case, you'll be looking at those future resources, the SMRs, the long duration storage, multi-day battery storage. And then, as I mentioned, under the gas case, you'll be looking at gas with potentially carbon capture, hydrogen conversion in the future. To the right here, you will see the scenarios I just described at the top, and then some sensitivities that EP will be running for those scenarios. So the first, we talked about it earlier, and I cannot stress this enough. Load growth is the most challenging and optimistic view of the future right now for utilities. We deal with a lot of utilities. This is not EP specific. You are constantly hearing utilities who are looking at doubling, tripling the size of their system in the next 5 to 10 years. Right now, keep in mind, we have gone through decades as a nation with pretty much flat electricity growth. And all of a sudden, we're looking at utilities who are potentially looking at building what they've spent 100 years building in the next 5 to 10 years. So load growth is a big issue that every utility is facing right now, and it's a core issue as part of this IRP. So we have three different cases here. The first case Emmanuel described is the floor earlier, is the 2024 load forecast with the large load growth. It's the blue line you recall from the slide earlier on. That sets the floor. That's the lowest we should be planning to. Emmanuel also said that doesn't represent even a fraction of the interconnection requests that EP have received. So we're going to have another scenario where we look at that base assumption plus some additional large load growth on top. And then finally, we have electrification scenario. So, excuse me, high load growth economic electrification scenario. In addition to potentially just normal large data center loads or large loads coming online, you've also got to remember, as we strive towards decarbonization of this economy, a lot of that means is electrification, right? So mentioned earlier, you know, coming from Excel up in the Permian Basin, a lot of the effort there is to decarbonize the natural gas industry, which means electrifying the natural gas industry. So decarbonization of the transport industry creates strain on the electric system and it creates load growth. So we also need to look at another scenario where we have additional load growth. And then just finally here, we have a number of sensitivities on gas prices. So we have just the base case. We also stress test decisions under different fuel assumptions, different market price assumptions, to make sure the decisions you're making today upstand through like the scrutiny of if you're stress testing them under different market conditions. We go to the next slide. How am I for time, Margie?
About, yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay.
Do questions then?
I think for the most part, I've already addressed this slide again, just looking at the different technologies. Here they are listed. So in the interest of giving time for questions, I'll move on. Next slide. Okay. So here is just a representation of everything I've just discussed. So as we're looking for EPE, we look at the no gas scenario. So this would say, hey, this is the least cost plus the REA requirements plus the RPS requirements under the different load growth assumptions and then under our fuel forecast. And then if we go to the next slide, we just have another representation here. This is now assuming you can build natural gas. However, it has to be carbon free by 2045. And again, you see this decision tree. Now, if we go to the next slide, I do want to spend just a little bit of time on this next one. Here, we're now looking at the stakeholder requests. So how can everyone in this room be involved in this IRP process? So we've just talked about the scenarios and sensitivities that EP you're going to run is just best utility practice. What we're now looking for is the involvement of the people in this room and the people on the Zoom call. So if you guys can look at this decision tree and say, you know what I would like to see is I would like to see these assumptions, but, and then give your input into what else you would like to see on top of these scenarios. And we have a form designed to do that. So we go to the next slide. I believe Margie is handing out the form just now. Okay, perfect.
And you got it in Excel form in your reminder for this meeting that came from Deborah yesterday. So the Excel version you should have in your email.
So with this form, either manually, handwriting, if people are still writing with pens these days, or go into the Excel form, you would go in and select, for example, I would like to see the no new gas case under the base case and large load forecast with the base fuel assumption. And in addition to that, and then in this box here, I would like to see EP do X, Y, and Z. So let's just do an example. I would like to see EPE do a 100 megawatt demand response program. And then you would put that into this box here. What we're going to try and do is we're going to then collate those responses. And then from my previous experience, what we see is we get a lot of people asking for very similar requests, right? So then we're going to go back, we're going to try and combine those requests into a reasonable number. We're going to probably need to come back to the stakeholders and say, hey, we need a little bit more detail. We need to quantify some of these inputs and assumptions. And then once we've reached a shortlist, we'll present them in the April meeting. And then these will be the the scenarios, excuse me, and sensitivities that we run through the modeling process. So Margie, I'll pause there and happily answer any questions.
Questions first from people in the room, and then we'll go to the Zoom questions. Yeah, John.
Could you give an example of the kinds of demand response? I'm not sure what the state yet, but let's say we're interested in demand response. Are we supposed to suggest specific types of things that would be demand response? Or just say we want you to model demand response?
As detailed and as quantitative as you can be makes this process easier for us. Understanding though, we do have a difference in people's experience levels and people's knowledge base here. So if you were just to come through and just write demand response on the bottom of this piece of paper, we're probably going to call you and say, okay, let's work together. Let's quantify this a little bit.
So could you name 3 or 4 demand response type options that would be viable to model in this system?
And so demand response, it depends on like how detailed you want to get to. I would say demand response at high level is one, there's not 3 or 4, right? Now, when you want to get more specific, then we start getting into the more different kind of options there. So demand response, 100 megawatts additional program by 2030 would be a starting point, right? When we come to model that though, we're going to need to know more information. So we may ask, okay, when you say demand response, what's the duration of that demand response? Can you interrupt a customer for 2 hours, 10 hours, 2 days? So we need to start quantifying it. How many times can you interrupt a customer a year? Can you do it only in the summer? Can you only do it in the winter? So there's lots of sub questions that we're probably going to have after we see the stakeholder request. I would just say be specific as you be as detailed as you can initially.
And John, before you respond, and because we know there's several people interested in demand response, increased demand response possibilities, we'll have a small group talk about that during the modeling breakout this afternoon. So we can kind of collectively explore the parameter space.
Just a process question then is, as we're selecting which group to be in.
Yeah.
Are both of them going to be doing that same sort of suggesting, or should that take place in the modeling group?
So we're going to focus on those modeling scenario parameters in the modeling details breakout. The breakout that Kathy is going to facilitate is going to maybe conceptualize a scenario, but without as much detail. Right? Kathy, is that a good
Yeah, and
characterization?
we'll take time after lunch to really look at these modeling forms and kind of translate a little bit of what is it that you're hoping for the EPE system and what does that mean for this form, how that might play out.
Okay, great. And then just one more process question, just so we understand where we're headed.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot is being covered today. There are a lot of things to think about. Will we be able to huddle with our subgroups and stuff and then suggest them over the subsequent weeks?
Yes, what we're going to get as far as we can today with the conversations in the room. And as Ben indicated, there may be some follow-up conversations with subgroups. And then we've got a deadline that we're going to impose of March 25th. That's 2 weeks, 10 business days from today, to have your final forms turned in. If there was anything that you wanted to talk with your colleagues or about and then resubmit, that's okay. But we're hoping to get the majority of major scenario topics covered today, but there will be opportunity to turn in the form, and then we'll work with the EPE and E3 team to consolidate, maybe set up some sub-Zoom meetings with the few that have that as an interest and try to further refine the parameter.
Okay, then one last process question. As we're working together over the next 2 weeks, is there a pipeline by which we can ask questions just so we are not missing the point? Is there some way we can submit or talk to people about as we move that direction?
Yeah, let's think about that. I don't have a good answer yet, but let's think about that as we go through today and determine that'll be part of what we can talk about, Emmanuel, in our next steps when we wrap up this afternoon.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Good.
Go ahead.
I was gonna add something to the breakout sessions. I don't think you should think that the modeling is the only one that's gonna answer any modeling scenarios.
Yeah.
Like, the modeling is gonna represent different policies or actions that EPE may have, right? So it's just gonna be a little bit more in depth, but you can still be at the policy discussion and think about DR or different clean energy or resource technologies, but maybe just a little higher level. So don't feel like you need to go to the modeling session. If you want to talk about certain scenarios and sensitivities, you can also talk about those in the policy session.
And in the policy question, there'll be people there that can answer modeling questions as well.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just want to piggyback because Nate went exactly where I was going now. I brought up this loads of resources table just real quickly. So if you're ready just to jump straight into demand response is the example and start talking about duration of calls, frequency of calls, and really get into the weeds, go to the modeling team. If you're still sat in this room thinking, you know what, maybe I understand what demand response is, but I really don't understand how it impacts this loads and resources table. And I really kind of want to understand how it then goes into the modeling. And you're kind of at that higher level, then stay in the educational and policy group. We will be happy to still get into modeling in that discussion. The other thing I will say is it is a discussion. We're consultants. Nate's extremely nervous that we don't have PowerPoint presentations to present during these meetings. So he's really excited his comfort zone. So it is a discussion. So we just do encourage people to come into there. It is not going to be a presentation when we break out. We are going to be sitting there discussing all of these.
A couple other, let's go to the Zoom room and then we'll come back to the room. Kathy,
Yeah,
question?
so if we could go to the slide then that you had with the boxes there, slide 43. So a point of clarification, and I'm reading from Ramon. Thank you for your contribution here. First to clarify, is it correct to say that only signed service agreements are currently being included in the 2024 large load forecast?
I believe that is true. Yeah, but the ones that we have a high degree of certainty that are gonna occur.
Okay, so Ramon, high degree of certainty of large loads are included. So furthering on that, he's asking about the speculative nature. I think we've all heard data centers particularly are kind of shopping around, and how is EPE addressing some of the speculative large loads that are looking?
Well, that's the second group, right, that we talked about. We have a group of high certainty, and then we have a very large group of a varying range of certainties, right? You got people just, asking, can you manage this amount of load at this, in these years? And you've got others who are much more specific. But none of which have risen to the level of, high degree of certainty. So, yeah, within that second group, you got a huge range of, extremely speculative to, a good chance.
And the way we deal with this in modeling and analysis is through scenarios and sensitivities, right? We have a base case of what we're quite certain about, as you stated. And then there is uncertainty about other data centers. So we need to explore what if all data centers decide that they want to come to EPE across the US, right? Huge load increase. Or what if, just a little bit more, or maybe organic load plus data centers. So we just test these with sensitivities, see, what would be the impact on the resource.
And I'll just say as a metric, as Ben said, you have utilities looking at significant increases in the size of their systems. It isn't difficult for us from the degree or the amount of interest that we've gotten to say our system could double in 5 years. So just to, is that the high degree of certainty? No, but it's certainly something we need to model. And so that's just to give you an idea of what we're looking at in terms of expressed interest.
So is it fair to say that?
I would interject. What Jim's saying is that there's an input for E3 to go evaluate the system of what we can and can't do and what are likely outcomes. The question that was sort of asked is what deals are we making? And the answer somewhat is we don't make deals with people that we can't have confidence in how we're going to get it. So when you ask about inquiries, and you had that line with the 2 bars and get inquiries, that other bar is up in the ceiling somewhere. And we just can't do that. So we try to put some confidence to the nature of the people who are dealing with us so that we can evaluate our ability to respond to it and then evaluate how do we give E3 a reasonable number to model the system. Because if we tell E3, I can plan 10 gigawatts next year. He's like, sure. How quick you want me to get to know? So we have to give some reasonable number for scenarios and modeling, but the company as a whole, and I speak just in the trenches, we can't say yes to things that we don't see impacting. And so there's lots of inquiries and there will continue to be so. And those people are asking us, and you name every utility in North America, they're going.
Look, let's see if there's one more, was there something else?
There
on
is,
the
and if
queue?
I could follow, so is it fair to say, given the future that you're looking at in the next 3 years for the action plan, is there a pretty wide range of uncertainty? More than you've seen in past IRPs?
Absolutely.
Okay. And
Anything else?
yeah,
Or-
there's
and
more
then
questions,
Steve.
yeah.
Sure, and maybe this is a question for the room, not, I know you're not sitting in a model right now, Mr. Elsey. But, you know, if El Paso Electric hadn't abandoned Newman 1 and Rio 7, could you all have gotten to an LOLE of 0.1? Maybe this is something, you know, in the near term, is that something that you all have already modeled or something that you need to model?
It's something that we would need to model, but the Newman 1 and Rio 7 would not have been enough to get us to that 110.
Good question. Steve, you had something else?
Yeah, with these data centers, if they happen to go down, there's a big risk in terms of higher rates for other customers. What you've made and invested to support that data center. And they could potentially be a very high percentage of the total load. In the way that you assess, or that we assess, what are the protections that you can put in there with data centers decides to close down? And we're stuck with all that capacity that, you know, they have to spread across all the rest of the customer base. And how do
You're
you
looking at me, but I'm gonna look at Jim. But we are always putting protections in there, 'cause we are, I don't say risk averse, but we're not gonna carry risk for these guys.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, you know, ask you, what's your general plan for addressing that risk? And being sure that, you know, residential customers don't get stuck with the bill.
Right, so, you know, utilities deal with that risk all the time with large customers, small customers, and but your assumption is always that your load growth is such, assuming it's like ours and historically, you know, sufficient to, as you have this churn of customers coming, customers leaving, you know, your system manages that, you know, are you a little over capacity, under capacity over time? That's how a system is designed to operate. In this current situation where you're seeing a historically you know, abnormal potential for load growth, utilities are having to plan around exactly that risk, exactly what you talked about. Generally speaking, across the country, that's being done contractually, where you say to for one of these customers, you've got to sign a 10-year agreement with me that you're gonna buy power from me for 10 years. And if you leave in the 3rd year, contractually, you'll have to make me whole for the 10 years. And so that's the protection. And so the assumption there, and I just throw 10 years out there as an example, but that's all about if the customer were to leave, how long will my system take to grow into what I had planned for? So for example, if I have an expectation that if I do have a large customer come and then leave shortly, but I have a high expectation that another large customer would come in, you know, I'm having that kind of consistent growth, then I have less of an issue with that risk. If I have an expectation that, look, it all comes in and then we go back to this, you know, 2% growth over time, then losing a big customer is going to knock a big hole in my system, and I have to have some protection for that. So it's a variation around the current approach. Is my load growth sufficient to fill up that capacity in the near term? or do I have to have a long-term protection? And so that long-term protection, especially with some of these, I mean, there's discussion around data centers at a gigawatt, right? That's 1,000 megawatts. So obviously not in a system like ours, but in a large system. And even in markets, where the participants of the market are making these requirements that, look, you've got a contract for a long period of time so that I make sure I can recover my investment. So contractually is how you deal with that risk.
And if I can, one thing that Jim touched on was like that customer growth to fill them in. And I think that even if unlikely, but we should feel good about, is we're one of the fastest growing utilities, especially in the nation and really in the region. If you were to look at PNM or TEP and you were to compare load growth or load 10 years ago to now, we used to be much smaller than both. And now we've passed PNM by several hundred megs last year, the year before, and TP were kind of right in line. And say we've grown 188 megs recently, 183 megs year over year, and 150. You know, so it's not going to take many years to fill in. We're one of the fastest growing just with organic node data center.
Right.
Can I just make one final point there? I just want to remind everyone as well, as we talk about uncertainty, that we talk about this being a 20-year plan, and it absolutely is a 20-year plan. With a big asterisk, it's refreshed every 3 years, right? So as we look further out into the future, that cone of certainty becomes wider and wider, right? The number of resources you need becomes bigger and bigger over time. But this isn't EP just making this plan today, and then 20 years later, they've done the plan, right? They're going to look at it every year, just like with utility best practice. Then every 3 years, they're going to refresh this plan. So, you know, as things change, if all of a sudden we go into 2026 and something's fundamentally changed, there's still processes in place where EP can shift, can pivot for those changes.
Yeah, Kathy, one more question.
Yeah, a quick clarification from Zoom. Kara, do the data centers require building new capital infrastructure?
Yes and no. I mean, that is a function of the size of the facility, the nature of our system, the location of the facility, say relative to the proximity to transmission lines. So it really depends on, it's very situation specific in terms of the capital investment needed.
Okay.
One more and then we'll go to you.
For the modeling
Go ahead.
studies, are alternate rate structures fair game for consideration, or are we constrained to the status quo and different rate structures pushed down the road to rate cases?
No, I think the way to see rate structures in terms of what customers see in terms of price differentials on peak off peak, things like that, is to think of that as a sensitivity around the load forecast. So you could have say our base case load forecast and then make an assumption, for example, that within 5 years you're to full, mandatory time of day rates. And what's the effect of that on the profile? Is it, how does it affect your peak demand, for example? How does it affect your total energy, things like that? So think of that rate structure as something affecting a sensitivity around your load forecast. Because your load forecast is based on, your current assumptions, around your current rates, and then you could look at situations where you have rates that you assume are going to say reduce or slow the growth of your peak. But that's a sensitivity in my mind.
Yeah, completely agree. So we have a hourly load forecast that goes into the model. If you want to look at a time of use rates impact, you could just simply say, hey, for these 4 hours between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m., or we can move that till midnight to 2, and you can see how that would impact the portfolio.
Great. Kathy,
So I'm gonna come back to Kara's question. So on the main screen here, brought us back to the loads and resources table. So to translate her question about the capacity need being short, even in 2026. So seeing it in red there, Ben, what does that mean for EP?
So when EP are in the red here, so when they're short here, it means they do not have enough accredited capacity to meet their load projections plus their reserve margin. So what this would mean at high level is EP need to take action either by building supply side resources or by lowering this firm load obligation, so lowering their demand, and that could be through time of use rates, demand response, it could be through behind the meter generation. But it means right now they would need to take action on either their resources or their loads.
Good. Okay, thank you. Ben, was there anything else you or Nate wanted to cover? Are we ready to move to breakouts?
I think we're ready for breakouts, yeah.
Excellent.
Nice.
So let me tell you what's going to happen next. Thank you very much for the conversation as well as the material. Let me describe what we're planning to do in the breakout sessions, which will be from now until 3 o'clock, when we re-adjourn and share outputs from the two different conversations. Let me go to the slide deck here and describe to you what our plan is. Lunch will be included in that. And we're going to break for lunch so that you can have general conversations outside of the modeling of the breakouts if you wish. So here's the plan. We've got 2 breakouts scheduled. In the room next door that Kathy will facilitate is going to be a policy and education breakout. We've set that up with our teammates from EPE and E3 to allow those of you who may want to explore some of those base questions like Ben was talking about. How do I interpret this loads and resources table? What does it mean to be short on capacity? What are the general concepts that you still are want some clarification on? And then talking about some of the current policies that are in place in New Mexico and some of the headlines, current events that are driving needs and opportunities that the utilities are facing. So it's really to stay at a level of concepts, of discussion of policy. It could stimulate ideas about scenarios or sensitivities that you have an idea would be good, but you don't want to get into the detail of the exact number of demand response hours that are going to be called upon or those kinds of things. So it's intended to stay at a level for especially folks who want some more general education to be part of that. The second breakout will be in this room, and I will facilitate. Again, we'll have our teammates from EPE. There may be times that we have to shuttle in a subject matter expert to the other room, but we'll just be agile in that in case questions are important to resolve in the moment. And we'll have questions regarding EPE, process on modeling, details, inputs, assumptions, all of that is fair game to discuss, with the idea of being able to fill out that modeling request form individually or as groups before we leave today. So we'll encourage you to collaborate on those. And we can get more copies of the spreadsheet, the modeling request form. You also should have that on your computers on email from yesterday in Excel form if you want to fill that out real time. And after those breakouts, a small short session before lunch, the box lunches will come. We'll have lunch wherever you'd like. We'll reconvene our breakouts and then continue that conversation until just before 3 o'clock when we'll report out. So are there questions about what's going to happen next? Or if you have ideas but not sure which group you want to be in, feel free to talk to Kathy or I as we're breaking here. But that's the plan. You Zoom folks, you will have a choice at 11 o'clock of which breakout group you would like to be in. So watch for a note from the Zoom host, master, Deborah Shields or Michelle, who work in the breakout rooms. You will have a choice of which breakout room you want to go to. What we'd like to encourage is for whichever group you start in, please stay in that at least till lunchtime. And then if you feel like you want to shift or go to another conversation, maybe you've gotten your questions answered about load and resources table and say, okay, I feel like I can dig in to details on modeling, feel free, or vice versa. You've had enough and you want to go to policy and education. At noon, we have lunch and we come back into our breakout session, give you a chance to switch if you want to. But if you'd stay in it until lunchtime, you'll get to meet some more stakeholders and start the conversation about what's important to you. So, questions about what we're going to do next? Kathy, is there anything else we need to give on directions? Okay, well then, please get up and stretch. It's 10:48 and at 11 o'clock, in 12 minutes, we'll start our breakout discussions here in modeling, next door in policy education. Thank you. Kathy, I can't add all of
First of all,
Can I hear? Yes, I got me.
Okay, home stretch, folks. Please have a seat. We'll finish up. And hopefully those of you on Zoom can hear us and see a slide that says reports from breakout discussions from today and a forward look. First, we're going to hear from both groups as to how the afternoon went. I see there's no broken bones. There's nobody in the breeze. This is good. And I heard lots of great discussion. So We're first going to start with the policy and education group that Kathy was facilitating. And I think you have a spokesperson. Is it Kara who's going to report out for your group? So Kara, if you wanted to come off camera and come on camera and unmute, we'll have you do a report from the modeling or the policy and education group. Go ahead.
Great. Okay. This shouldn't take too long. And I have the experts here to help fill things in. We started with a discussion of what the statement of need and the action plan are. The statement of need is based upon a longer view over time than is the action plan, which is shorter and focuses more on, the next 3 years of time and the immediate actions the utility will take to meet the energy needs of those next 3 years. The model that the utility develops is created around answering the question of what is the solution. I think I got that right. Did I, Ben?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And then we dived into what the model is actually looking for, and there it was shared with the group that the model is really looking for the least cost portfolio, which gets considered first, reliability, and then any state laws like the renewable portfolio standard that is in place. Another example of a state law in place was the EUEA, or energy efficiency requirements. Our group had a wide-ranging conversation about modeling in general and what variables define certain aspects of the model. So for example, we spent quite a bit of time on the question of what gets considered as contributing costs. And Ben was able to share that, there's two fundamentals of costs, fixed and variable costs. He described those and gave examples of fundamental costs being those associated with building a unit. So for example, a gas unit, the fixed costs of building it do not change. However, variable costs would include things like fuel, chemicals, possibly labor. And we were able to raise the issue of the social cost of carbon in this context, and how that may or may not get considered as a cost. And then we moved on to the output of the model, and the initial solution of the model will be the lowest cost. Various variables get considered. I think I already went over that and may have been repeated. I'm not sure. We talked a little bit about load forecasting and, what the utility can consider as load growth, or as the forecast grows. Data centers were particularly focused upon, and we discussed what are those various sizes and types of data centers that the utility considers and what those look like. Let's see, what else did we move? What else did we discuss? We moved on to a discussion of what time frame is considered in creating this IRP, and it was shared that 20 years is used because that's what's required. However, the model actually uses the full life of the plant. So that's just something cool for all of us to consider. a question was raised whether greenhouse gas emissions are considered in the model at all, or how those get considered. And we learned that for the RPS, emissions, or the Renewable Portfolio Standard, emissions are not considered, but the energy source is considered. So in New Mexico, we're moving from higher emitting sources to lower emitting sources. And in the RPS, we have a shift that moves progressively from renewable energy sources to carbon-free requirements, which renewable and carbon-free requirements allow for various technologies to be introduced and used. Then we moved on to the specific need for stakeholders to complete the change request forms. We were given instructions about which boxes to check. And within the context of how stakeholders can contribute various modeling suggestions, there were questions about, you know, how does the Renewable Portfolio Standard get considered in the model, for example? And it was shared that the Renewable Portfolio Standard drives decisions regarding what gets modeled, but the overall timeline goals of the Renewable Portfolio Standard are the ones that get used, that are the ones that are used by EPE. And as we know, and perhaps the broader audience knows, the RPS changes percentages over time with an eventual net zero goal in 2045. We had a really interesting conversation about transmission and distribution costs, and transmission and technologies that can be considered here. We also discussed supply side versus demand side energy and what that could look like. Specific requests from this group of stakeholders included better understanding the variability of greenhouse gas emissions in different seasons, specifically in summer versus winter. Do those emissions change? What does that look like for the utility? And then we'd like to know, what technologies does the utility consider in these models, including grid enhancing technologies. And that was the conclusion of our meeting. Perhaps Kathy or Ben would like to fill in if needed.
Thank you, Kara. No, I think that is a great summation. I'll just reiterate. So there were 3 specific requests that came out of our group. First, as Kara referenced, this briefing on emerging technology for transmission and distribution. So how is advanced conductors for transmission or power flow capabilities, how is that being captured or considered? The second request, as Kara said, was on greenhouse gas emissions, and specifically a summer and winter peak, trying to better understand the carbon intensity of the system and when it is that carbon intensity is at its highest. And then the third was from the Southwestern Power Service and Public Service of New Mexico. Those 2 stakeholder processes last year. Are there lessons that we can learn, or on the stakeholder runs, anything that we can build from rather than just repeating some of the stakeholder requests? So is there something from those 2 efforts that can be drawn in to support the stakeholders in their modeling requests? Did I capture that? Anybody from our group have any adds or edits?
Candy, can you repeat the first one around transmission? It was transmission
So,
impacts or alternatives?
briefing from the modeling team, what kind of emerging technology for
Emerging.
transmission and distribution is considered in the modeling? So Ben walked us through some of the considerations of how say advanced transmission technologies, how might that be captured or considered when you're looking at least cost portfolio? So we'd love to hear what that looked like as you got through the modeling and how that played out. Anything else to add from our group? Fabulous group, everybody had lots of questions. We heard from everybody, so really appreciate the excitement and enthusiasm and exploration together.
Are there questions from the group that was in this room of the group that was in the other room? Questions from Tara's report out with Kathy and Ben? Any questions?
For the carbon, we're gonna beat this dead horse till we get an answer. The greenhouse gas emissions, I think I just heard Kara say that was based on fuel consumption and not. What,
Just repeat the question, maybe?
so does the model, I thought I heard in our group, that the model has some, emissions content output of the model that's specific for each unit in operation.
That's correct. Yeah, just to clarify to the earlier comment, what Cora was describing is the model itself does not have a constraint on emissions. So we're not forcing the model to only get to maximum emission level. We do have the RPS requirements there, but we do have outputs on an hourly basis for emissions.
Good, thank you.
And that's the request of the group to be able to see that seasonal variation of carbon specifically across the portfolio that's selected, or
Currently, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, on the greenhouse gas emissions currently on the system, where are the most carbon intensive periods? Both winter and summer.
And we're trying to see, it's one thing to adjust load, but there may be opportunities to see where the carbon intensity is, so we can respond to that, and the resources can respond to that. So it's just, that's part of the requirement, is that we prioritize lowering renewable emissions greenhouse gas emissions. So we're just trying to respond to that requirement.
okay, good, thanks for the clarification.
For the transmission piece, and they were talking about emerging technologies. Some of the technologies are pretty well established, dynamic line ratings, advanced conductors. I think it would be interesting to listing those technologies, getting a sense of how much they can help the system, how much money they can save. And I don't know if you guys can model this, but does it become part of a transmission investment program? You can kind of demonstrate the benefit of reconductoring with advanced conductors, or and how does that fit into the picture? I think that's okay for this IRP. I'm not sure how much detail on transmission you're ready to get into.
Yeah, I think that may be where Margie put on like an agenda item for a future meeting, is to do a deeper dive in the differences between the old IRP to this new ISP, and we can talk about kind of how we're representing the transmission system and how there are solutions to improving power flow between different zones. And we can jump into that in more detail in a separate session.
And it's kind of not getting into a lot of detail, but just kind of preparation, setting the stage for the grid. Yeah. Topic that's going to be coming up.
And that was an active topic in this group. We had an active discussion about transmission as it plays into resources and getting resources from generation to load, and options for reducing losses in transmission, advanced conductoring things. So we had a conversation about that. Sounds like we want to revisit that as part of this IRP to ISP transition conversation. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think we can embed that as we're starting to pull together the modeling scenarios. It's maybe just to try and carve off some time just to talk the best we can about the transition from IRP to ISP.
I think it's also great public relations that you're identifying these specific technologies and how you're moving forward.
We just, it always becomes very challenging when you start talking about transmission topology is to keep it at a level that doesn't become market sensitive and confidential. So we can work with the EP folks to see what we can present in the transmission topology representation. And then also, just at this point in time, we haven't gone as far to like identify what the transmission solution is, whether it's new lines, whether it's reconductoring lines. What we're really looking at the moment is, can we improve the transfer capability from one zone to the next?
Right.
And how you actually achieve that is, still up for discussion. But I think we can cater some content to at least start.
Yeah. So I'd asked them about it, and Bryn was saying, new technologies, and Bryn was saying, oh, we're doing this all the time. And I'm sure you are. Just, get it out there so people see it and understand it. And you may be able to model it or may not, but in some way or shape or form, it should get into the IRP so people know it's happening.
Okay, other questions for the group? Yeah, Jane.
So I'd like to hear from Ben or one of the Paso Electric staff, why we as customers should be convinced that after all this effort and work to get stakeholder input and to putting together a resource plan, an integrated resource plan, that it really is going to happen, that what would be 2 or 3 good reasons why we should believe it is going to actually be implemented.
So I can take just something really quick as far as from the regulatory compliance. So, in the earlier portion of the presentation, you remember Emmanuel presented on our 2021 integrated resource plan. So in that process, similar to what you all are doing now, we got stakeholder input. We wanted to hear on the modeling. We looked at most cost-effective portfolio, and from that we came up with a 4-year action plan. So there were those 7 items that you saw, and we just went into detail. This is exactly what we did from 4 years ago until now. This is how we implemented. That's what we're doing. So that's something that we want to do now, as required by the IRP rule and the action plan that we displayed earlier. Those are things that we're looking to do. So we're trying to develop an action plan at the very end of this process, along with the statement of need and how can we implement that. So, I don't know if anyone wants to add on to that.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's because we've identified what's going to be most effective beneficial to the system, and that's the mission. That's why we're here: safe, reliable, affordable energy. Both. I mean, at the end of the day, we are. So, yeah, it's what's best for the public. It's best ultimately. What's best for the public. It's best for the building.
I have a question on that came up right at the end, Ben, what we were talking about, I hadn't really thought about. So we spend all this time developing kind of what proportions of resources are most cost effective. And then it goes out for an all source RFP process. What comes back may be entirely different than all the planning we did, right?
Potentially.
Yeah, and so we would then, so to Jane's point, it may be different than what we're thinking now, but it would presumably have to be an improvement in some way, right?
It would be an update. So yes, you would hope it would be an improvement, but what you would want to do is you want to file the IRP based on generic assumptions that are available today, and then you're going to issue an RFP to firm up the resources, right? So yes, hopefully it'd be similar, but it could be different. But then there's a regulatory process that follows the RFP, right? There's the CCN findings.
So then at that point, EP are going to be held accountable for the decisions that they made at the time. So yes, could they completely go and change and go for a new resource portfolio? Absolutely, that could come out of the RFP. They're going to then have to justify that in the CCN. And they're going to have to be able to explain, but actually when we issued the RFP, X, Y, and Z changes, make these changes, and this is why we have now have portfolio today.
So, and Jane, let me add to that. I mean, part of the motivation, as I understand from the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission for this new process was multifold. First of all, to make the process more transparent to people who may not be experts or are regular interveners in the process. Kind of open up that black box of modeling so that there is a chance for people who have insight and ideas to question, to offer ideas, to be involved in that discussion. And then thirdly, to tie the plan more closely to the procurement activities that happen next. Clearly, some things change. I mean, load demand could go way up. A new resource technology might come online. Another one might, fail miserably and not be available. And so it's a dynamic process. But the commission really wanted those three things: that more transparency, open up the black box of modeling, and have a tie between the planning and the procurement. So that is from the regulatory perspective, what the intent of this stakeholder process was. What we have seen as facilitators is the utilities are greatly benefiting from the broader conversations that have been happening under this new rule, because there are people who hadn't been involved in the past who come to the table and express their ideas. So hopefully that answers some of your question and motivation. And I cannot speak for the utility, but what I have seen in the past couple of years is that utilities are greatly benefiting from the input they get from the table.
I would say the answers are very helpful.
Good.
Could I just add one more comment?
Yeah.
I think when we go through these IRP processes, we tend to fixate on the result and the outcome, right? But what's probably more valuable is the input and assumptions that go into these processes. So yes, is the end result going to be different from an RFP? Probably. But what's really critical here is that we kind of try to reach consensus, try to reach agreement on these inputs and assumptions, because we've seen it today with load growth. That's going to be the defining factor in this IRP. So we can have these conversations, agree on what sort of a likely input assumption going into the RFP. That is a fantastic step in the right direction.
Good. Excellent question. Let's shift to the next group. Now, we had people madly filling out their modeling request forms, so we don't have a spokesperson, so you're stuck with me reporting on what we did. We had 50 or 60 question topics that the group submitted, and the team, EPE and E3 team, did a fabulous job addressing most of them. We had a few that we didn't get to. And then folks talked about what kind of modeling run request ideas they had and filled out a number of modeling request forms. And here are the themes that came out of that discussion, though some of the specifics we still have to dial in. Looking at long duration, multi-day storage as a resource was one. Looking at the Las Cruces climate action plan targets on reducing natural gas use in buildings, and perhaps even extending that beyond Las Cruces to a larger region. Looking more specifically at industrial load growth and really digging into what that high growth electrification economic development might be, maybe even adjusting that more aggressively, don't know, but we had a lot of discussion about, can you predetermine what impact meeting that load would have on various customer classes, but we realize that's outside of the range of model run capability, and so that's a future sort of rates conversation. But in fact, looking at industrial loads and their significant impact on the system was one. I'm not sure, Phil, I'm not sure I understand completely on the flexible load additions for data center. Do you want to say some more about that?
Yeah, sure. What I'm talking about here is loads or customers who can take advantage of really low renewable energy prices. So if you have an excess amount of solar energy during the day, for example, you have customers that can take advantage of that. What I'm thinking of is could be Bitcoin mining, it could be large language model learning processes, the processes that happen before you engage with the model, or hydrogen electrolyzer to generate hydrogen. You know, having a usage for the excess solar generation can really make it more profitable, more feasible to build more solar. And that solar is not just waste.
Okay, so that's like attracting an industrial enterprise or one or more that take advantage of variable solar resources.
Right.
Is that, okay. So we'll talk some more of that. I didn't understand that from your form, so thank you for that, for the explanation. Looking at demand side resources, and it was really helpful for me and the team to talk about what some of the assumptions are in there, and there's some discussion about even maybe accelerating that possibility, and then the future conversation about how you would incent that to happen, and maybe try some pilot programs, might be an action plan idea. So those were the 5 that I've been able to study through, but there was also discussion about virtual power plants, separate from demand side resources. Are there distributed resources out there that could be called upon, dispatched, made available? And I think people are still thinking about that one as something a little bit different from a demand side resource. But others in the group, what else is in your brain that didn't make it yet to the modeling request form? Comments, question, group, what else, what did I miss that the group next door needed to hear about?
We talked for a while about weather modeling, and that was actually very enlightening that you've gone to a 10-year model, which is, I think, going in the right direction because we are seeing changes. If you're looking at a 30-year model, you might be washing over those recent trends of increases. So that's a good step, I thought.
Yeah, things have changed in our understanding of climate and weather. Good. What else is important for the group next door to hear? Alan, question?
Rent.
Yeah.
Changes. When we talk about that, I think that it was supposed to go into the base assumption as to what changes in demand might result from changes in rates, going to time of day rates or other types of time varying rates.
Yeah, and our discussion there is that the modeling, correct me, I should have you guys describe this, but the model doesn't have the ability to look at the impact of rates on different customer groups. That's done in a separate process, as I understand from George.
Yeah, it would be a base rate proceeding.
Right.
Now, there used to be a requirement, and I think last week we have to provide more information with regards to future rate design changes on long-term outlook. I need to check if that was limited for like 1 or 2 IRPs, or is it just perpetually going forward? Like that, there was some new language that we had in the law, we have to come up with more rate design information.
But that was a topic of interest. Go ahead, Nate.
Yes, I think we have somebody filling out a form for the same request. And I think the question was, how are rates used in our model? And depends on what model we're talking about. We're talking about capacity expansion modeling. I'm sorry, I'm going in the weeds because this is the modeling group topic, right? We don't put the rates into our model and tell the model to, expand resources, constrain to some rates. We typically take a load forecast from load forecasting team that assumes some sort of rates or some sort of like future growth of load because of X, Y, Z, and that goes into our model. Out of the model, we do get costs like for expansion, and that can help give an indication of what the impact on future rates would be. But if we wanted like a time of use rate scenario, or the example I was giving was like if I raised your rate to $100 per kilowatt hour, you're gonna stop using electricity as much as possible, right? It's gonna impact how you use electricity. And so that on the load side, so that would be an input to the model. Change kind of the load profile or the load growth. Not that we're trying to like suppress demand or anything, but maybe just shift it around. And then that would be kind of how we think about that. So we do have a sensitivity with like high load electrification, for example, but we could, for example, have a time of use rate kind of design where we imagine, our profile may shift from a peak at this hour to a smaller peak at that hour, and that load is shifted, of course. Yeah.
I think what we added that language before, it was kind of like an extra scenario, kind of like we described it. It was from a unit's perspective. If your long-term forecast can be layered on some kind of some use rate, it will reduce X amount of over 20 years. Outlook. But I'll look into that and see what we provided in the past. Maybe we can refresh it.
It sounds like what you're saying is that rate structure affects load, and load is an input to the.
Exactly.
And it's difficult because, we'll always propose different things to the commission, and I can guarantee you, every time we propose something on a base rate, it will change. So it's just,
Yeah, very good discussion. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, we had this was a sidebar discussion I had with a few folks, but there are rules in place at the PRC. That sometimes can be pretty restrictive about what we can do. And what we're discussing is that an IRP shouldn't be afraid to suggest revisiting the rule in order to enable an action you might feel constrained from doing. So I'd just like to encourage the EPP folks, which who are probably closer to the rules. If you see that kind of obstruction, I don't think you should feel shy about raising that. And then in the IRP, we can maybe say, we encourage the commission to explore this change to the rules. Because I think that's an important part of it. And those rules could be real constraints. So I get it.
Yeah, this is another good discussion for our action plan. If the way we take care of the action plan is we have stakeholders suggest ideas that need to be folded into the plan in order to achieve those 20-year objectives. And utility do the same thing, the things they think need to happen in order to achieve that 20-year plan objective. And we talk about them, and those things that look like they're agreed upon, they get added momentum in the report, in the plan. And things that may be disagreements between the stakeholders and the utility also can be documented. But that is a good place to recommend changes in policy, action, whatever, conversations about those kinds of things. And that's a good topic for action plan. So.
And in the short term, you can seek a waiver, right, to the immediate rule. And then longer term, a rule change.
Correct.
Yeah, sure. So, good. So that's where we ended up. We're still having some folks take a look at the modeling run request, and people are exchanging ideas. And you'll hear in a minute from Emmanuel about what the next steps are in this process, including a deadline for us to receive any forms that we didn't collect today. And we're considering offering an opportunity to hold like an office hour Zoom meeting with the El Paso and E3 experts and GridWorks facilitating. If there's something that's come up in your idea about a modeling run request that you want to kick around with us or with other stakeholders, we'll schedule that before the deadline for turning in the forms so that we can continue this dialogue. And don't be surprised, like Ben said earlier, you might get a call if you've turned in a form and you'll have questions about how to enable the run that you have envisioned. So it's gonna be active for the next few weeks, and at the workshop in April, we'll hear the disposition of all the modeling run requests, and that'll be very important input to the modeling staff.
We have that question, if I could repeat, just emphasize, will folks be able to see what modeling runs are requested? And yes, we will bring that back at the next meeting, see the full complement of where we ran.
Yeah, we'll do our best even to capture some more substance of these ideas that were developed today. That will go in our workshop summary from today. So you'll be able to read that and it might spur ideas or you might have questions about it, but we will include a short write-up of all the requests that we've received to date, including from some of our teammates there on Zoom, so that you can see those ideas and it might stimulate thoughts. So, yeah, Nate.
I was gonna just maybe share one more thing. We're doing a lot of different model runs and scenarios, but and we'll be going on to different presentations and different topics. But there's one thing that came up in a discussion in this room that I want to emphasize is that when EPE is doing these modeling runs, all of these scenarios have kind of a common base, right? First, you have your existing planned resources that are in their system. And we're modeling, additional resources to meet load as it grows. But then all of these scenarios, and there's no trade-off here, right? All of these scenarios will meet the reliability constraints or targets that EPE has. So for example, we're not going to run, maybe, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of another scenario here, like a greenhouse gas emission scenario where we decide, well, let's meet our greenhouse gas emissions, but we don't need to meet our reliability target, or we'll loosen that, right? That's not happening. All of these will make sure that they meet a reliability target. They'll all meet the RPS target. Those are what we call constraints or hard constraints. And they'll all be least cost. So given those constraints, what is the least cost portfolio that we can build? And I thought that would be good to emphasize because even some of the more informed model or team people said that wasn't always so clear. So we're going to build all these scenarios, but they always are ensuring affordable, clean, and reliable electricity from EPE. I don't know if I used the wrong terminology, but if EPE wants to expand on that, I'll just flag that, yeah.
Yeah.
We did have the same conversation next door to how the model serves.
Good.
Good. Okay, well, we're scheduled for the next outbrief from you, Emmanuel, and what we thought we'd do is hear a little bit about what's next in the modeling effort. We're going to emphasize there's actually 2 forms that we're going to make sure you all have. You've seen one, which is the model request form, but stay tuned. There's another one we're going to share with you. So, Emmanuel, over to you.
So thank you, everybody. You get to start and end your day with me. Sorry for you. I want to start off. Thank you, staff, GridWorks, all the stakeholders, everybody who participated. This was a really great turnout. I'm really happy with it. As you can tell, we brought a lot of EPE subject matter experts. That was on purpose because we wanted to be sure that all of your questions and concerns were addressed in the room or as quickly as possible. This process is important to us as it is to you. So the stakeholder input here is vital to the process. Something I want to mention that was a little disheartening when I was out having these sidebar conversations with everybody and have a good conversation. I said, well, thank you for your question. And they go, yeah, right. No, I mean it. Thank you for your questions. There is no silly question. There's no dumb question. There's no question that we won't answer again and again and again. The more informed you are, the better the process is for us. So the more informed that you guys are, the more you know what's going on, the more we get an idea of what's important to the public. And the more we get an idea of what you want to see come out from the utility from this process. So again, I encourage it and I'll say it again and again. Your input is important. It's valued. Give us all you got, all your comments, all your questions. If we need to answer something again, teach you something again, please don't be shy about it. So next steps, you have the modeling request forms. Please take those, well, don't take those, turn them in, but they're also available on the GridWorks website. Think about what they were, what was said, come up with more ideas, ask more questions. They're going to be due in 10 business days from today.
25th.
Yes, the 25th. so what we're gonna be doing, like Margie had mentioned, is we'll have some office hours. Again, to address more of your concerns, more of your questions, and make sure that you're getting what you want out of this process. We are gonna be setting up an EPE SharePoint site. There'll be more instructions on that to come, and that's how we're gonna be able to share data back and forth with everybody that registers on the site. Our next stakeholder meeting is gonna be April 23rd. So that one will be just virtual. And again, just thank you for GridWorks for putting on this successful endeavor and putting up with all of our crazy ideas. And thank you for everybody. This was a great turnout. I'm really, really happy with it. So that's all you got from me.
So a couple of next steps, yeah. Let me.
No questions, Nick.
Yeah,
No.
I'm gonna come back to you, Nate. Yeah, right. He gets, question amnesty for all he does. If you wish to access modeling information, that's both input and output, that Judy has a form and it's on our GridWorks website. It's called a contact form, but it's really your details of who you are, your email, and it's going to be your request to get permission to access a SharePoint site with all these data. All right, so let me just reinforce that. If you want access to the information, please fill out this form and you can either email it. If there's instructions on where to return it, you can leave it today or you can email it. And we want to make sure you have access to that should you desire it. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, please fill out the form and submit the form. But just an FYI here, when we talk about modeling inputs and modeling outputs, we've got 5 or 6 more meetings. We are going to be presenting a lot of modeling outputs.
Yeah.
Inputs. So please don't feel the need that you have to go through this huge database, looking for information, putting all the information yourself. If you've got a question, please just ask us, the EP team, and during our next 5 or 6 meetings, we can present the data for you.
Exactly. There'll be insight that goes along with the data, but we know that the formal IRP rule allows stakeholders to have access to the data itself. And so we want to support that particular requirement in the rule. But as Ben pointed out, Nathan will probably reinforce, there will be presentation and conversation about that information throughout the next few workshops. So don't feel like that's the only place you can go. And if you don't want to go there, or you're not an expert in pivot tables and such, don't worry about it, right? You'll be able to discuss it here. Yeah, Nate.
Yeah, I was just gonna emphasize, if you could not understand what Ben was saying, it's talking too fast, with that accent that I don't understand. We're gonna put his email address up. Forward all your questions to Ben. He's happy to answer.
Oh, I've got his cell phone. We'll just post that.
Great.
For the record, I only had an interpreter once in the last meeting, so that was a record for me.
What was that?
So if you know right now that you're going to want access to the SharePoint site, feel free to raise your hand. Judy will get you this form. It's also on the GridWorks website and in PDF forms. So it's available. There's no real deadline on that, but the sooner we know, the easier it is to design the system to accommodate your request. So again, March 25th for the stakeholder modeling run request forms. We'll be letting you know of a time or two for some office hours in case you want to discuss your request or one of the requests that we summarize in our summary from the workshop. And then let me just show you what's this rest of the schedule. Any questions before we show you what's next? Okay, thanks, Emmanuel. So up on the slide, you can see where we are. We're really here on the March 11th workshop. The last set of sort of preparing for getting modeling results is our April 23rd workshop in the afternoon. We're going to hear some feedback from the EPE and E3 team about how the modeling requests can or can't be supported. It's kind of a disposition of those requests and a refinement of those parameters. And then in May, June, July, the focus of those workshops is going to be briefings in series of these modeling outputs and conversations. So we know it's not gonna all come in one presentation. We know there'll be needed time to digest and evolve that conversation. So that's really the focus in May through July. And then we haven't set the date yet for either late July or early August to have another workshop like this with a combination of in-person and Zoom participation. But the focus is really gonna be to hammer out the statement of need and action plan, right? So we'll have great insight from the different modeling runs. We will discuss those. We'll take input from everybody on those two deliverables, the statement of need and action plan. And then that will be the end of the input for the IRP. EPE will be filing their plan on September 1st, 2025. And then we will invite you to one more workshop in September on virtual platform to get some feedback from you. Did this process work for you or not? What would you suggest doing differently in the future? Because that is part of our deliverable to the Public Regulatory Commission on how the stakeholder engagement process worked or didn't, what things should be changed, what should be preserved, what should be tossed, that kind of thing. So we will definitely value your input in how did it work for you and suggestions for improvement, because there are some more IRP stakeholder processes that are coming up in the future for the state. So that's what's next. I'd like to review where we started today. We started with connecting you all and our Zoom participants with this objective of informing modeling run requests. We heard presentations on the most recent IRP and the action plan that came out of that. Heard about scenarios and sensitivities and tried to understand how the next step of modeling is going to occur. We had policy, education, and headlines discussions, and sounds like a very robust conversation about modeling overall. We spent time focusing on details of modeling from a wide range of topics, from load to transmission to resource technologies to tariffs to rates, and came up with at least 5 or 6 different topics that are worth filling out in more detail for stakeholder requested modeling runs. So that's where we've been today. You all have been great participants and tolerant of this a bit awkward format of incorporating our in-person and Zoom folks. We hope that our Zoom participants were able to hear the conversation, and we got some great input from them as well. Next time we do this type of workshop in late July or August, we are again going to encourage in-person participation, because we think that that dynamic is just much better and more content rich when we can be together in person. So we will be getting a summary out from this workshop the end of this week, and you will get that from Deborah Shields, along with links to all these documents that will be posted on our gridworks.org website. And we will look forward to getting any additional stakeholder requested run forms in by the 25th. You'll see in the summary, we'll send out an announcement of when we're going to hold this virtual office hour construct to answer questions. And we'll see you all on Zoom on April 23rd. So thank you for your time and your insights, your participation. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you to all of you Las Cruces residents for hosting us here today. So Kathy, anything you wanted to add?
No, really pleased. I think the quality of the discussion in our room hopefully answered a lot of questions, and really appreciate everybody making the time to join us today.
Great. Judy, anything from your end?
No, again, just to reiterate, Gridworks and Manuel and Bree's comments, we really want to thank you all for coming out. I know just y'all have been with us for the 3rd meeting. It's a process, but your input and your feedback is really important. So,
Great. Well, safe travels if you're out of town, and thank you for your engagement. Bye-bye.